them, don't
Many
they?
leaves are down here.
Yeah.
Here.
Good morning.
Morning.
Come on.
Thank you.
Right, good morning everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So our second day using these headsets. We've tried them before, they've been absolute disasters, but this seems to be working quite nicely. Right, welcome on board. I'm Andrew, one of your two boat masters on the boat today. It's normally only one and a helmsman, but Stuart here, our other boat master, doing the steering this morning. Now before we go, very important safety announcement. You've all boarded through an emergency exit down there at the stern, the back of the boat. Emergency exits forward here through the bow doors, port and starboard, left and right. All the windows unlocked, some are open, they're also emergency exits. At the stern, a 65-man life raft, life rings with lifelines attached, heaving line and boarding ladders, and a further 8 life rings on the deck above us up here. Fire extinguishers in the forward and after part of the vessel. You may wish to open the window. The sun is coming out from behind the clouds. It gets very hot on this boat very, very quickly. It's the hottest floating greenhouse in Cheshire. If you wish to open the window, the easiest way is to stand up, face the back of the boat, and pull the window towards you. You can push, but it's difficult. So pull. I can give you a hand if need be. However, if you are then sitting next to an open window, please do not be tempted to stand up, lean out and fall in. Now we can get you out of the water, not very easily, but you'll be very wet and very uncomfortable for the rest of the day. So the rules for the window is fairly straightforward. It's both on the lift and on the river, is to look out and don't lean out. And in the highly unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the crew's directions. Any questions there in relation to the safety? Now firstly, anybody on board from anywhere exotic? Overseas, for example?
Warwick.
Well, it's over the Mersey and the Ship Canal, so that's if you live on that side of Warrington, of course. You may be on this side, yeah. Anyway, I live locally down in Barton here. Stuart lives over in Antwerp. She's not too far away from Shropshire. Okay, behind us the Trent and Mersey Canal. Now I've changed my story, my tale over the past couple of weeks, and I might get a little bit tongue-tied, because I used to start talking about the river. I'm going to start talking about the canal. It opened in 1777, principally for the pottery trade. Josiah Wedgwood was the person behind its construction. The potters were fairly fed up with what existed then in terms of the transportation systems. They had the River Weaver, or the Weaver navigation, but they still relied heavily on roads to move a lot of their goods around. It was expensive business, bringing in clays and flints on horseback. It was also an expensive business sending out the finished product, carefully packed in barrels and in baskets, the pottery and crockery, the bone china, layered straw to protect it, lashed to the back of a pack animal, sent on what was here on the River Weaver or Weaver navigation, a fairly short 30-mile journey from the potteries to Winsford. Damage. 30% of everything that was being packed was getting damaged on that road journey. Not sustainable. They needed to do something about it, and the answer was the canal. It's 92 miles long. It stretches from Shardlow in Derbyshire on the navigable River Trent, heads northwards and westwards, and despite its name, doesn't quite reach the Mersey estuary. It reaches the Bridgewater Canal, 3 miles short of Runcorn. The Bridgewater made it to Runcorn first from Manchester in 1773. The canal was also used by our local salt producers. Salt has been produced in Cheshire now for over 2,000 years, since the late Iron Ages. The early method of production was fairly straightforward. So going back to the Iron Age times, you find yourself a brine spring. Unbeknown to the early salt producers, the upper bed of rock salt was only about 50 feet below the bed of the river. Fresh water worked its way down, dissolved the rock salt, and it returned to the surface in the form of brine. It was boiled away in pots, and the residue left behind the salt was sold and bartered. The Romans improved upon that. They set up salt production in Northwich, in Middlewich, in Nantwich, over in Droitwich in the West Midlands, the same bed of salt we have here dips under the Midlands conurbation and rises on that side. They were here for 400 years. They improved the techniques a lot. They started to dig brine wells, brine pits, and boiled the brine off in lead pans rather than in clay pots. They left. Along came the Anglo-Saxons. I think that's where the name witch became used as a suffix to indicate a connection, a potential connection to salt production or salt trading. So we have the 4 towns I've just mentioned. We had Ipswich in the East Anglia, a salt trading town. And yesterday, further confirmation, we've heard it before, we had a group of people on from Kent, amongst them 3 from Sandwich, and when we said Sandwich, we believe they produce salt there by boiling or evaporating seawater, and yes was the answer. So Sandwich in Kent, that wich suffix indicating salt production. But the Anglo-Saxons were replaced by William the Conqueror, and he came along in 1066, but it took 20 years for the Domesday Book to find out what he'd actually managed to conquer. And Northwich, or not Northwich, but this area of Cheshire here gets a significant mention in relation to salt production. Now have to leap forward quite a few years to the early years after the end of the English Civil War. We'd already establishing the British Empire in North America. We're moving out to the Caribbean, West Africa, round to the East Indies. Salt was in great demand. It was needed to preserve food for the long voyages that the ships were making. It was needed to barter. It was also needed to preserve food that was purchased while the voyages were going on. Increased demand for salt meant an increased demand for fuel. And the fuel locally available was wood. And they were burning so much wood, they were running out of it, and had to bring in coal by pack animal from the North Staffordshire coal fields. Using horses was an expensive business. And the local landowner, William Marbury, had a good idea. Knowing full well that Cheshire is surrounded by coal mining areas, he thought he'll prospect for coal here. And in 1670, looking forward to becoming a very rich coal mine owner, he started to dig his first coal mine at Dairy House Meadow, which is about half a mile distant from us here, and high up on top of the valley, so not at the river level, but much, much higher up. Won't be a second. Down he went, 120 feet down. Can you hear me all right without the microphone for the moment?
Yeah.
Okay. If there's a problem, let me know. Once the engine's running again, I'll go back to it. 120 feet down, didn't find coal, he found the upper bed of rock salt, nobody knew was there. And that was the change of the salt industry in Cheshire, from what had been fairly widespread small-scale production into a very definite industry. And if we were to look up the river valley after the 1670s, we'd have been seeing salt mines and brine works, not simply little brine houses, but brine works producing salt. It was satisfying the increasing demand. But the local traders were still not content. The salt was carried overland from here to Frodsham on the Mersey estuary, about 12 miles distant, again on pack animal. And they'd calculated that if the river could be converted into a navigation, so converted into a canal, one barge of this size could replace 400 pack horses on the roads, which was a huge saving in time and in money. They began to lobby Parliament in an attempt to get the river converted. There were many local objections, not least from the horse owners, who'd calculated that between 3,000 and 4,000 families would be directly affected if the river became the main source of transportation. That's the amount of salt that was being produced. It could employ 4,000 families in this area simply to move the salt around. However, they get their way. In 1721, the first Act of Parliament is passed. And in 1732, eventually, the river is owned as a navigation. and salt is going out by sailing barge from Winsford and Northwich and this area here in particular, and off down directly to Liverpool for export around the expanding world, the expanding empire. Coal was coming back upstream from the South Lancashire coalfields, and the potters of North Staffordshire took advantage of it. Prior to its opening, they'd been relying on the estuaries of the country and the roads to bring in their raw materials, on the flints from the east coast via the Thames and the Humber and the Trent, here on the west coast, china clays from Cornwall, the West Country, via the Severn and the River Mersey. In each case, these significant and expensive overland road journeys. The river opened as a navigation, and from Winsford, just a 30-mile road journey to the potteries. Then along came the canal, 1777. The issues of transportation on the road still causing problems. So with the canal opening, and with the river and the canal both carrying the same goods to and fro, the same distance to the same place at Runcorn on the Mersey estuary here, they're in competition with each other. The river loses trade, 25% in the first 2 years after the canal opened, and the lift here is the second successful example of how they got their money back. It wasn't the first thing that was here. Now, how do you arrive in your narrowboat back in 1777? With perhaps 10 tons of finest bone china on board, on its way to North America via Liverpool. Here's a good place to take a break, because ahead is a fairly difficult journey for you. It was made more difficult in later years with the introduction of, or the building of, or opening of, no fewer than 7 public houses in the first mile of the canal. Only one remains today across the canal from us here, the Stanley Arms, and 3 other buildings are still evident, are still there down the canal here. But just after the final public house, which closed in 1900, the Reaper's Arms, we believe it was very grim inside, is the first of 3 problems that the boatmen had to deal with. It would slow them down significantly. Man-made, very definitely, not locks and not bridges, and they still slow people down today. Any ideas, anybody, what it could be? Make sure I've got my right photographs here. Yes, wonderful. Okay. No. Oh dear, lots of blank faces. Well, what we have down here are 3 tunnels. Now, this was one of the very first canals in the country to be completed with tunnels. They were, by the standards of the day, they were pretty big. They were the first substantial tunnels ever really built in the country. But widest point 13'6", narrowing down to about 10 feet in places. Oval in shape to give them some support. No towpath inside the tunnel. So problems on getting there. What to do with the horse and what to do with the boat. So firstly, the horse. Any ideas? Take it over the top, as easy as that. Some horses will take themselves over. They knew what to do, they just carried on. How do you get the boat through the tunnel?
Legging.
Anna, what sort of legging were you describing there? Were you describing that sort of legging?
Yeah.
Wrong. But half the mark though, because it was legging. The tunnels were too narrow. And they were not too narrow, they were too tall for that sort of legging. If you lay on the roof of your narrowboat, you'd get, well, you wouldn't even get foot spin, you wouldn't even be able to reach the roof of the tunnel. So they had to lie on a plank across the bow and leg through the tunnel. Here we go. And this is Barnton Tunnel, photograph taken. This is the first tunnel down the canal here, a mile away. And this was taken in the early 1960s as a demonstration on how they would have legged boats through tunnels. Do note that the leggers here are wearing substantial hobnailed boots. Back in the day, they couldn't afford footwear. They wrapped the feet in whatever they could find. They became known as the toe rags. There we go. And can you see this little? Can you see that little bit of white up there? That's something politicians refer to very frequently, but most politicians have never seen it, and you have now. The light at the end of the tunnel, there we go, well done, right. That is the portal at the far end of the tunnel, that little bit of light there. There we go. So you get to your tunnel, you've got to find or hire leggers to help you get through, you've got to take the horse over the top, you've got to go through in convoy because the boats can't pass in the tunnel, they are too narrow. You get through the first tunnel and there are 3 or 4 convoys ahead of you waiting for the southbound traffic from the other 2 tunnels to come through. You've got 2,000 yards of tunnel, 2,000 yards of tunnel, 12 miles of canal. How much time will the boatman set aside for that journey? Hours. Marks for that one, days, marks for that as well. 2 to 3 days to travel 12 miles. Well, getting to Runcorn, not the end of your problem. 63 feet above sea level, your narrowboat can't go to sea, the cargo has to be transferred into a sailing barge, and somewhere there in Runcorn, between the 2 basins, top and bottom, there are 9 locks to deal with as well, and then a 12-mile journey across the estuary to Liverpool to the sailing barges, so to sailing ships. 5 to 7 days to travel 35 miles. Down on the river though, a very different matter. Sailing barges. In the early days about the same size as this boat. They got bigger as the years went on. They could carry 4 times the cargo of a narrowboat and could be away from here fully laden, and given favourable winds and tides, could be alongside the ocean-going sailing ships at Liverpool docks in as little as 8 hours, a working day away. A huge saving in time and money. The Weaver trustees knew they had the advantage. Their plan was very simple. They wanted to find somewhere where the river and the canal were close together, and they would transfer goods off the canal down onto the river. And they chose Anderton, which may seem a strange place, but not really, because they filled in the old riverbed that ran behind us there when they straightened the river out. So knowing that the old river was behind us, they dug it out. And in 1793, using horses and carts, they brought the goods down from via horse path from the canal down to the river and started to transfer the salt and the ceramics, and the trade picked up nicely. By the early 1800s, they were beginning to install chutes and inclines, and indeed railed ways or railed roads, and stationary steam engines to assist in the transportation of goods between the 2, so raw materials going up and the finished product coming down. 1830, they've completed the digging out of the old riverbed basically and made a huge basin down here on the right hand side. Further chutes and inclines. Very successful, became a very busy inland port. But by the middle of the 19th century there's a big problem. They've created a bottleneck. They've become too successful. The salt was being transferred by handcart, dug out of the narrowboats, put into the handcart, taken along trestles and tipped down the chutes into the waiting. Other caisson coming up here now. I think we may have 1 boat in. 2 boats in. You may stand up and have a little look if you wish, and wave if everybody's happy to do so. There's Ted. There we go. Thank you. As the caisson goes up, about 2 or 3 feet or so below the top, you'll begin to see a distinct line of pitting and corrosion, ex-pitting and corrosion, coming up into view now. It goes round all the caissons at that height, and more about that in a moment or 2. So 1 handcart can transport about 1/3 of a ton of salt. Even the small barges could hold 80 tons of salt. That's 240 journeys by handcart, and there was more than 1 handcart, but nevertheless it was a tedious process. Pottery and crockery had to be craned off and craned on, very time consuming. And Edward Leader Williams, then engineer on the river, was given the task of finding the best method to transfer goods here. And he'd worked out quite simply that if the narrowboat could get alongside the barge, you could transfer the goods directly from one to the other. But that meant taking the narrowboats off the canal down onto the river. So what options were available back then to move goods from one level to to move the boats from one level to another? Anybody? Even today you probably think of it, the first thing would be a lock. Now here's the Bingley 5 rise in Yorkshire. Now we'd need a similar set of staircase locks here. But there's something on this photograph, or something at Bingley that they have, that we have not got here at Anderton. Does anybody perhaps see it? It's not easy to see, but when I do tell you, it's obvious. Not the length, but you're getting there with the length. we haven't got a hillside. We're a very, very steep slope here between what was the old river and the canal. So the absence of a hillside to build a set of locks in basically means you can't build a set of locks. It's very straightforward. Now the next option here, and this is a later version, could have been an inclined plane, and this is the Foxton inclined plane in Leicestershire, which is basically railway tracks laid on a slope between the two waterways, and you send the caissons up and down,
A bit like
steam assisted,
at the seaside.
on wheels, counterbalanced, very efficient. Issues again with the lack of land, but the other problem here is that we'd have to perhaps straighten out the canal to allow it to accommodate the caissons moving up and down, and the canal and the river were in competition with each other, so that wasn't going to happen. So an inclined plane, a Foxton incline, technically a success, financially disastrous, great shame. No, couldn't have been built here. What was needed was some sort of space-saving device, and Edward Leader Williams had the idea of a double caisson hydraulic boat lift. The big problem for it was it hadn't been invented and he wasn't a hydraulic engineer. But nevertheless, the Weaver trustees liked the idea. They made contact with Edwin Clark and his company, and between them they designed the boat lift. Double caisson, steam assisted, water hydraulic and counterbalanced. It took 2 years to build and opened in 1875. The method of operation was clever. In the building behind us was a steam engine. It raised water pressure in a device known as an accumulator, a huge single-cylinder iron pump on this side of the lift here. Beneath each of the cast iron rams, and the cast iron rams were more or less the same size as our modern stainless steel ceramic coated ones, both rams operated out of cylinders. The cylinders and the accumulator were interconnected via pipework and valves. Then, as now at the end of the working day, both caissons sat down at river level, but back then we'd have been surrounded by river water. The lift operated from 6 AM till 10 PM at night. In the morning, early in the morning, in came the engine driver to get the steam engine going. He'd raise water pressure in the accumulator, and by 6 o'clock it's time to send the first 2 boats up. Open the valve between the accumulator and the cylinder, and with the steam engine working hard, the caisson takes 30 minutes to get to the top. Out go 2 boats, in come 2 boats to descend, and meanwhile at the bottom the second pair of boats are being loaded to go up. Now this is where it gets clever. It makes the operation unique, nothing like it in the world at the time. Using the accumulator, we raise the lower caisson out of the river water by 6 inches, and as it rises out of the water, an automatic siphon system kicks in and drains off that extra 6 inches of water. And the holes for the siphon pipes are not used since 1908. Are still being seen today. There's one that's been overdone there. There's 2 on this side. 8 of them in total. That reduces the weight of the caisson by 15 tons. So now there's an imbalance. That one is heavier than this one. Open the valves between the 2. That one wants to push the lighter one to the top. And using the accumulator to get the caissons into the final position, the travelling time was reduced from 30 minutes to what the first boatman to use the lift back in 1875 described as a very frightening 3-minute journey. Doesn't tell you why, but just have a little think. How many people in 1875, excluding miners, had experienced vertical travel? 3 minutes in the open air, standing on a boat, floating in a tank of water. I think you could justifiably be frightened. A theme park ride, except in today's standards, it would have to probably do that while it was doing 50 feet, wouldn't it? There we go. Now there were problems with the lift. It was a brand new design, some issues with poor quality castings, some issues with subsidence, not much. You will hear more about subsidence as we go up the river. But basically it worked. But they made a big mistake that led to the lift being converted into what we have around us here. And that was the choice of hydraulic fluid. They chose to use canal water. Today we use oil. But in 1875 they failed to take into account that for almost 100 years prior to the opening of the lift, we'd had numerous brine works establishing themselves. Basically in all the little villages alongside the canal from here to Sandbach, 20 miles distant from us, and 8 locks uphill. The method of loading the boats I've alluded to already. It was open chutes into open holes. And on breezy days, the salt didn't always go directly into the hold. It would end up in the water. So by 1875, they're using salt water as the hydraulic fluid inside a cast iron system, which caused problems. It wasn't best practice then, it would certainly not be today. It was corrosion. And what suffered most of all was the cast iron ram. Now, it was okay for the first few years, but by 1885, they've got to do something about it. It had rusted. The rust had flaked off, and behind the rust, pitting and grooves had developed. And where you get pitting and grooves going through a seal, the seal at the top of the cylinder to keep the pressure in, you get a loss of pressure. That means the steam engine has to start working harder. The lift is becoming less efficient. They have to try and fix the problem, and they make another mistake. They chisel out the corrosion, it's quite reasonable, and then hammer in copper, a nice malleable metal, and smooth it off. Everything's back to normal again, but not for very long. They either didn't know, didn't realise that copper and iron were chemically dissimilar metals. Introduce them to salt water, you get an electrolytic reaction. The copper was eating away at the metal, the iron. They had to try and fix the problem again. And given the experience, would anybody like to guess as to how they fixed it for the second time? And it wasn't just the second time that they fixed it. They chiselled out the old copper, cleaned out the corrosion, and hammered in more copper. So by 1895, they'd used 1/3 of a ton of copper to fix the problem they were actually making worse by fixing it in the first place. Not best practice, not best at all. So they sought the advice. The then engineer on the river, John Sainer, sought the advice of the chemists from Brunnemon's alkali works across the way from us here. Despite appearances, it predates the lift by 1 year. And they said, why on earth are you using salt water? Try and use fresh water instead. So, fresh water, I know what we'll do. We'll fit a condenser to the steam engine, convert the steam into distilled water, and use that. And yes, it helped. And John Sainer estimated that it gave the rams about another 10 years of life, which was just about right. Because by 1900, with frequent downtime due to repairs, they were considering building a new lift. Now, this was Edwin Clark's first boat lift. He went on to build further boat lifts in France and in Belgium to his improved design. And he'd learned his lesson from here at Anderton, and that was not to trust the waters above or below. So in both countries, he made sure that the upper water was of good quality, and it was. And down below here, to make extra certain, he put gates across the bottom to keep the lower water out, and installed pumps in the wet dock to keep it dry, so the caissons and rams could operate in and out of fresh air rather than water of dubious quality. Hence the corrosion we saw on the caisson when it went past. That's corrosion caused by the river water prior to 1908. So new lift, Anderton concrete stands over here. When that one was up and running, this one would be converted to the new standard. Potentially 2 working boat lifts here. But wasn't going to happen. They didn't have the money, a cheaper alternative was required, and that's when John Sainer steps in again. He said, most of the lift is in good condition. Keep the bits that work, get rid of the problem, the hydraulics, and convert it to an electric counterbalance lift. And that was agreed. So between 1906 and 1908, basically everything we see around us here went up. 5 pairs of A-frames. Up on top of there, the machinery deck, in turn supporting 450 tons of winding gear. Attached to each of the caissons via steel cables, 252 tons of counterbalance weights. 30 horsepower electric motor each side. Cables went over the pulleys at the top. 252 tons is the weight of the caisson with water in it. It's also the weight of the caisson with our 36-ton boat in it. As we moved into the caisson, we moved 36 tons of water out behind us. Archimedes' principle, for those who may or may not remember it from physics lessons at school. Down below, gates were installed to keep the lower water out. Electric pumps installed in the wet dock to keep it dry. Those electric pumps, you hear it all right there? Those electric pumps were built by a world famous British engineering company who are still going today, with the origins in Manchester. Ideas anyway. Name a world famous British engineering company. Have you got the answer? Almost got the answer. It was Royce Limited. Is that right? Yeah. First cars built in Manchester in 1904 with Henry Rolls. I think they're arrested. So they moved to Derby in 1908. So in 1908 the lift opened. Electric lift. One man could operate each case on the division. Hugely versatile, and the best years of the lift were before the First World War. But upwards of 200,000 tons of cargo per annum was going through, up and down. But after both world wars, we see a big decline in the carriage of goods on the canal system. The railways had already taken the toll on the canals in the late 1800s, but after the First and Second World Wars, it was road transport taking over, door-to-door service, far more convenient. Then along came what's considered to be the nail in the coffin for the canal industry. That was a very, very cold winter of 1962-63. The canal system froze for weeks on end. Those who had been using the canals had little choice than to use the roads. And when the canals thawed out, very few returned. So by the middle of the 1960s, there was almost no commercial use of the lift at all. As Stuart goes out, he will be turning the boat perpendicular to the lift. So we can get a view on this side of the lift and take photographs of this is a classic view of the lift. You don't get opportunity to do it from the shore side here. So very little traffic at all on the other side. This side here, you won't get a photograph.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Get on that side there. Okay. Go on, off you go. Right. But don't tread on the velvet. So the middle of the 1960s, no commercial use at all. But 10 years later was our 100th anniversary, 1975, and we were blessed by a visit to celebrate. Now, who would come and visit us in 1975 to help us celebrate our 100th anniversary? More importantly, that might be an ecumenical matter, but it wasn't the Pope. No, go on. Any other guesses? Prime Minister? No, it was Blue Peter. Arguably more important. Anyway, there we go. We got presented with a Blue Peter badge, which unfortunately we've mislaid. In other words, we've lost it. We don't know where it is. However, we'd like to think that the publicity that Blue Peter gave us, well, basically 1976, English Heritage came along to visit us. And they looked at the lift, and they not only liked it, they listed it, and it became a scheduled monument, which placed an obligation on predecessors, British Waterways, to at least look after it. Now, they did the best. And in September 1983, it was time to do some much needed maintenance on the machinery deck at the top there. The painters were on the top deck, chipping and grip blasting away, and much to their surprise and horror, they didn't have to do much of either, because they could push the fingers through the 1-inch thick webs of those huge steel beams that go across there. The whole lift at the point of collapse. Engineers were called in, who closed it down. So September 1983 saw the closure of the world's oldest operating boat lift. Now that could have been the end of it. Thankfully, it had been listed, it was a scheduled monument, and all this happened at the end of the cold winter in 1962-63, with the mindset of the 1960s in relation to our industrial heritage, which was basically, if it's shut down, then we don't need it. It could have been flattened and ended up on a scrap heap somewhere. Thankfully, it had to be looked after to some degree. It didn't have to be repaired. So caissons were lowered, weights lowered, winding gear removed. And while all this is going on, the Trent and Mersey Canal Society locally and eventually other groups nationally were raising public awareness about the plight of the lift. They wanted it saving, it was too important to lose. A petition of some 15,000 signatures goes off to Downing Street, with our then MP, Neil Hamilton, presented to Mrs Thatcher, took a keen interest, and said that every Prime Minister would say, from whatever political party, you have my full support, but there's no money. So those in the highest levels of English heritage and British waterways got on with all the necessary surveys and assessments, came up with the final plans, and the cost £7.3 million. The volunteer groups raised an incredible £4 million of that through corporate and private donations, and the final £3.3 million came in from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and the lift was restored to electric pumped oil hydraulic operation between 2000 and 2002. So back up and running now for 22 years. Any questions at all there on the lift? Okay, go on now to Brunnermond's alkali works across the river here. Now I should say, predates the lift by 1 year. And John Brunner and Ludwig Mond had worked in the chemical industry in Widnes, which is about 12 miles away from us. And they purchased the rights to produce a very important chemical, sodium carbonate. Those of you in hard water areas might be familiar with it. It's a water softener. 50% of the world's production today goes into the production of glass. It's used in the production of soaps and detergents, and was used so for those purposes 150 years ago. They needed sodium, and were sitting on millions of tons of salt, sodium chloride, here in the county, and they needed limestone. They already had railway connections into the area here, so that was brought in by train from Derbyshire in the form of limestone, calcium carbonate. And they produced the soda ash. Became one of the biggest producers in the world. In 1926, it formed part of the embryonic, good word for the morning, isn't it, embryonic imperial chemical industries, and remained part of ICI right the way through till the 1990s, when they diverged and sold themselves off, and it was purchased by Brunnermond Netherlands, who remained independent, and they sold it in 2006 to the Tata Corporation of India. They still own it. Tata have established their European Chemicals Division headquarters here in Northwich. But in 2014, after 140 years of continuous production, Tata closed the soda ash plant here and moved production elsewhere. Would anybody like to guess where it went to?
Teesside.
Not to Teesside. Not to Wales, that's steel. Scotland. Nobody said China or India. But it didn't go to either of those either, so let me think. Wales is closest, because it went 3 miles away to the other works, the far side of Northwich here. So it's still very, very locally produced in huge quantities. I've been living here 25 years then. I didn't know that both factories produced the same chemical. So yes, Tata still employing huge numbers of people here locally. Now the whole site is due to be redeveloped. The current factory produces pharmaceutical grade sodium bicarbonate, which is used for tablet making and goes into and exported indeed to 60 countries worldwide from here for use in the filtration systems in dialysis machines. A new modern plant, going to be built at the back. Planning permission submitted for 1,500 homes on the site here. It's a huge, huge plot of land, classic brownfield. A 2.4 kilometre linear park alongside the river frontage. But where the factory stands, because of the likelihood of pollution in the soils, that's not going to be built on. That's going to become parkland, and so for the first time ever, the general public can sit on that side of the river and watch what's going on over here. We're losing a huge industrial icon. The site alone employed around 11,000 people in its heyday. We're losing that, but we can hopefully gaining something interesting or different in its place.
When's that happening?
It may happen soon, but we've got to. What has got to happen first is one of our main points of access to this side of Northwich is a listed swing bridge, listed structure. It's one way basically, traffic light controlled. They've only been talking about adding another bridge to make things easier, and an extra bridge, since 1937. So we could be waiting quite a while before this gets developed. But that's been laid down. There's got to be a new crossing below us here. But the site has a claim to fame that back in 1933, 2 chemists working here, Eric Fawcett and Reginald Gibson, were experimenting in the laboratories here at Winnington. They'd long gone beyond mixing chemicals in a crucible to see what might happen to them. They were mixing chemicals and popping them into huge pressure vessels. These pressure vessels were akin to 6-inch naval guns, basically, with screw caps on them. Sometimes these experiments went a little bit wrong. And these pressure vessels blew up. Now that is 6 feet, 2 meters tall, yeah? Wow, yes, you wouldn't want to be standing near that when it went off. They got a nickname, begins and ends in 4-letter word, beginning and ending in a B. There aren't many of them. Bomb, they were nicknamed bombs, yeah? Now, never any fatalities, certainly were serious injuries caused as a result of these things going on. Anyway, they've mixed 2 chemicals together, benzaldehyde, which is bitter almond essence, and ethylene. Popped it in the pressure vessel, tied it up, and stood back, safe distance, to see what would happen. With temperature and pressure increasing to 2,000 atmospheres, it was time to abandon the experiment. Fearful was going to be an explosion, they slowly released the pressure, allowed everything to cool down. When they opened it up and looked inside, lining the barrel, for want of a better description, was a substance nobody had ever seen before. It found something very, very important. They called it polyethylene. Today we call it polythene. They discovered the world's first plastic here back in 1933.
Wow.
They wanted to make more of it. 2 problems. One was surmountable, and that was the problem that the managers at the factory said, no more experimenting. We don't want anybody getting killed. Not unreasonable. But the other difficult problem that they had was that they didn't know how they'd invented it in the first place, because the experiment had gone wrong. And it took 2 years to realise that when they allowed it to cool down, air had been drawn in, and there was sufficient oxygen in the air to mix with the chemical inside, or the chemicals inside, and acted as a catalyst. Turned it into the solid we know as polythene, and then as a catalyst it had disappeared back into the atmosphere. So they never knew it was there. It was on the 1st of September 1939, the first place in the world where polythene went into commercial production. 60% of the world's plastics are polythenes. And despite all the problems with plastics, which are largely related to human abuse of it, rather than the plastic themselves, the polythene produced back in 1939 here can still be recycled today. It's an infinitely recyclable plastic. And early this year, at the head of navigation, we still have a connection here on the Weaver, 8 miles upstream from us. They've opened a new plant there, which is dedicated to do just that, recycle polythene. Okay, 1732, the river was a navigation. We'd have seen coal, we've seen salt mines and brine works around us here. 1790, go forward 110 years, 120 years, local mine owner decides to see what's further down. Perhaps prospecting for coal still. Digs down through a bit of rock salt and carries on. And about 250 feet or so down, finds another bed of rock salt. Much better quality and much thicker than the old one. And they gradually abandon the upper bed of rock salt and start to mine and draw brine out of the lower one. Now, they were not very good at mining or drawing brine. Basically, they didn't know where they were. So mines would break into mines into brine wells into mines, utter chaos going on underground. As a result, the land underneath was weakened significantly, which caused subsidence, mining subsidence, and the land collapsed into the mines, creating hollows in the ground that became known as flashes. And going back 150 years ago, because the worst time for the problems with subsidence was in the latter part of the 19th century, going back 150 years ago, we'd have been passing through one such area of water, collectively known as the Witten Flashes. At its peak, 160 acres of water around us here. A good-sized football pitch is 2 acres in size. So behind us there at Marshall's Wood, nice silver birch wood these days, that was Marshall's Flash. The Marshalls have been mine owners. Over to our right here, what is now Fury's Wood. The Furies and other mine owners here were mining the lower bed of rock salt. Furies, I think, had 3 mines in this area here. The mines collapsed, creating a huge flash, although sadly not called Furies Flash, but called Furies Pool. Hasn't got the same ring to it, has it? It stretched basically all the way from here, almost to where we turned the boat in Northwich. So huge, huge flash on this side. We've just passed over where the island rock salt, or the island salt works used to be. We managed to keep it up above the water, and eventually it sank beneath the water into the cut, into the navigation, because the old river was about 200 yards in that direction over here, in what is now Carey Park, which was a mixture of land and water over on this side. But look around us.
Yeah.
150 years ago, water. Today, it's land again. And it's land because of the unwanted byproducts of the salt industry and the chemical industry that needed to be dumped somewhere. And these hollows in the ground were the perfect place to put it. Do have a little look in the tree coming up here on the left. Two cormorants at least. They are very crafty. This has become a cormorant perch coming up here. You will see evidence of the amount of time they spend there by the white deposits on the leaves. Yeah. There we go. We saw a kingfisher perched on here on the last trip. On this old tree here. Sometimes get the odd heron perched there as well. Have a quick look above there and you'll see the cormorants. They love perching in this tree. There we go.
Oh yeah.
The most we've seen, I think, one with Stuart last year, it was 11. I think we had 11 from the one tree, and Stuart managed to take a photograph. There we go, yeah. You've seen them drying the wings, very well known for it. Oddly, despite being diving birds, seabirds, they apparently don't produce enough oil in the feathers to allow them to be waterproof, so they have to dry the wings off as often as possible to stay capable of flight and buoyancy. So we had unwanted byproducts to get rid of. Well, the byproduct of the chemical industry was a chemical called calcium chloride. Today it has a wide variety of uses and has value. Back then it had no value whatsoever. It had to go somewhere. It mixed well with water, so off it went into these flashes. And they gradually filled them up. But you've got a problem. The solids settle to the bottom, and eventually the liquids run off into the river, polluting it quite badly. You fill it up with solids, more solid, and then you get to river level. You've got a problem. How do you make your flash or lagoon deeper to accommodate more waste if you can't actually dig it any deeper? Yesterday somebody got it straight away and said you built a wall around it. Yes, that's reasonable. We had to build the wall out of something. So they used another unwanted byproduct that came from both the salt industry and the chemical industry. And this is that byproduct. Does anybody recognise it? Most people on board should. Shale. No, it's got shale and all sorts of horrible stuff.
Is it pig iron?
No. Although it feels like iron by the weight of it.
Yeah.
It's clinker. It's what's left behind when you burn low-grade coal. All the best coal back then was going off to the steam engines in the railways, the ships and the mills. But all the poor quality coal was coming here. I'll pass it round. Don't lick it. We don't know what's in it, and you think it may glow at night time, so be very careful. Right, okay. Yeah, they heated a limestone with it to get the carbons out of it, and also boiled the brine here to produce the salt, and this was left behind. So behind us at Marshall's Wood, the bund or the wall that went around the lagoon, the lime bed, rose 30 feet above the river. About the same height on this side. We don't quite know there because things happened on that side and on this side a little bit different. We do know this side probably no more than about 6 or 8 feet before something else happened over here. So these were lime beds. But by the early 1950s, the practice had stopped. They could sell it. Today, the calcium chloride is used in the brewing industry, it's used in the drilling industry, it's used as an additive for concrete. At the other end of the scale, it's got an E number, E509. It's a caking agent in commercial baking, so have a little look on the back of packets of biscuits and similar things. You may find calcium chloride mentioned there. So these lime beds were abandoned. And it would have been a pretty grim site here 75, 80 years ago. Very, very little growing, very grey, very grim. Early 1970s though, ICI and the County Council are getting together to see what they could do to improve this almost 1,000 acres of industrial wasteland. And they decide to create the Northwich Woodlands. They didn't just come along and plant any old trees though, they came along to see what nature was doing. And behind us at Marshall's Woods, silver birch trees, little saplings are doing quite well. So they planted silver birch trees, and as a result now, lovely silver birch wood. Any silver birch over here to our right hand side? Different soils. What was dumped there is fairly poor in quality. And this is Marshall's Wood under construction 100 years ago. There we go. Standard gauge railway across the top. Standard gauge railway across the bottom, bringing in ash, clinker and other unwanted byproducts from the chemical factory. Evidence of 6 or so sidings or spurs up there. It's the highest point in Northwich. Yeah. It's what? 60 feet above sea level. Sorry, 60 feet above river level up there. There we go. So poor quality soils, and as a result you have the sort of trees that you'd expect to find growing on poor quality land. Lots of sycamore, mountain ash, buddleia, you name it, very poor quality. Over to our left hand side here is Barron's Quay. That's part of our new redevelopment that we nicknamed the Barcode building when it was built, which I think is not, it certainly has that appearance, but not inappropriate. It's a multi-storey car park, and at the far end is Asda supermarket. There are other retail outlets there as well. Barron's Quay was the site of the last rock salt mine to close in Northwich back in 1906. And that was the end of 2,000 years of salt production in Northwich, from the Romans and even the Iron Ages right the way through, drawing brine and mining both the upper bed and lower bed of rock salt. Northwich suffered from subsidence. And whereas in the countryside behind us, when things subsided, the holes generally eventually filled with water. In town centres, when you have subsidence, the holes in the ground fill with buildings. Now this isn't one example, or the only example. This is a very good example of what happened to hundreds of buildings in Northwich over the years. Subsidence. Some had the misfortune to go off at ridiculous angles, like this one. Others had the slightly less misfortune to start to sink vertically into the ground. Some went overnight, very, very quick. There we go. That was a legal requirement for the building regulations locally back in the latter part of the 19th century. We're looking at the 1880s to 1890s. Examples of wooden frame buildings there to the left of the swing bridge. We shouldn't really complain about the sunlight, but now and again you've got to, haven't you? We can't see very well there. But there we go, wooden frame buildings to the left of the swing bridge. Sorry, yeah. Have a good look at the swing bridge though, I'm going to mention that in a few moments. But also as we turn, you must look and wonder at the most amazing waterfront anywhere in the country. It's classically wonderful 1960s tat. It is awful. We spent many millions locally on our modern shopping centre over there, and somehow the developers just forgot completely that they could have spent some money down here and improve the view from the river. Now when these were built in the 1960s, it was a new method of construction. Still big issues with subsidence, but they got around it by building low-rise brick-built buildings on concrete rafts with pilings to support them. Now, does anybody have any particular interest in air conditioning units? Well, so we can back down and move in. There's Mitsubishi, General Electric, Carrier ones up there. I have done my research. soil pipes coming out from Barclays Bank over there, Lloyds Bank, this one where those 3 units are. The Lloyds Bank soil pipes are far better, nicer, cleaner than the ones over that side. We've got barred windows, shuttered doors. It's absolutely grim, it's awful. It's classic 1960s. Built today, they would be facing the river. Like our new redevelopment here. Do look as well at the glass top wall there. We have more about that in a moment too. And also, as we go past the pontoon berths here, they float and they rise up and down on the pilings at the back. And the pilings look like pencils, yes, with a cap on top. More about those in a moment or two. But the swing bridge there was designed by John Sainer. Who remembers the name? The engineer who had the lift converted into electric operation. They were built in 1890, two of them, built in 1899 and 1898, the far one. They were the first electrically operated road swing bridges in Britain, but built at a time when the town centre was subject to subsidence. There was a risk that should the road levels drop, as roads subsided as well, or should the bridge foundation sink, you'd end up with a swing bridge swinging at a different level to the road, which isn't really very practical. You had to get round the problem, did it by a very clever method, and basically built both bridges on a floating pontoon. By adding and taking out water, you could raise and lower the bridge to adjust it and trim it. Indeed, today, they still take a little bit of water out to lift it slightly above the road level, so it makes it easier to swing. Swing it once a month for testing purposes, and swung 2 days ago to allow quite a big passenger vessel, not dissimilar to this, but quite a bit bigger, that operates on the ship canal in Manchester, to go through to the dry dock facility we have just upstairs. The photographs I'm going to show you next, I'll pass round, because it was our last serious flooding in Northwich. You get 100-year floods, you've all heard of the 100-year flood. We get them here about every 8 years or so. This was January 2021. I'll just point that out. There's the cap on top of the piling, and there's the bridge. The day after the floods, well, after the water began to subside. There we go. This boat can fit under that bridge in normal circumstances. I'll pass those around, I'll take them from you. Right, quick look here coming up at the lock gates. More about those in a moment or two. But very briefly, the redevelopment. In the late 20th century, the 1990s, survey done locally, and it suddenly realised that Northwich was about to sink into the ground. 60 acres of the town centre potentially disappearing or sinking. Had to do something about it. The money was found, and over a period of years they identified where all the void spaces were underneath, pumped out the brine that was within them, filled up the holes in the ground with a grout of sand, cement, ash and salt water, allowed it to solidify, and in 2007, at a cost of £34 million, the town centre was declared stable. And at long last, they could get on with the Barons Quay redevelopment. Not a good year to think about a new shopping centre. 2008 was the financial crash. 2009, in the early months, the beginnings of the change in our high street. Perhaps our most famous retailer, almost over a period of a few weeks, turned off the lights, locked the doors, and walked away. Woolworths, yeah, Woolworths. You'd never dreamt of it, would you, sort of 30 years ago? Woolworths just shut down completely. Others followed suit. Our high streets are changing. They're just losing shops left, right and centre. They carry on with the plans. Opened in 2016 at a cost of £86 million. And occupancy, local people think I'm being generous when I say about 50%. It could be less than that. Great shame, huge white elephant, nothing wrong with it architecturally, really pleasant to walk around, but the shops aren't there. Indeed, the occupancy isn't all retail either, so that makes it another little problem. But fingers crossed for it and other town centres that things will pick up. May or may not happen. Anyway, back to the lock gates. When the river became a navigation back in the 1730s, it had 11 wood locks on it. Now they proved to be too small, and over the years there was progressive increase. in the size of locks. The locks were gradually replaced and reduced in numbers. And by the 1870s, with the demand for seagoing vessels, or larger seagoing vessels, to come up the River Weaver, Edward Leader Williams, another name you've already heard, was tasked with doing something about it. And what he did is what we have today. He got rid of all the existing locks and replaced them with 4 ship locks. 2 down below us, just over 200 feet in length, and 2 just above us, slightly under 200 feet in length. In 1893, though, the Manchester Ship Canal was opened. That cut off our direct access to the Mersey estuary, so lock number 5, Marsh Lock, was installed near Runcorn. And at Marsh Lock we can leave and turn right for Manchester, head up to the lights of the city, or turn left to go to Ellesmere Port and back into the canal system on the Shropshire Union Canal, or indeed carry straight on and at Eastham lock out into the Mersey estuary itself. The locks on the ship canal, has anybody ever done a ship canal cruise?
Yes.
They're quite impressive, aren't they? We think 200 feet is big. Their locks was built back in the 1890s with 600 feet in length. Huge by today's standard, but monsters by the standard of the day themselves. Absolutely huge. These lock gates were built for Hunt's Lock, the next lock upstream from us. Now all locks, despite being the same sizes, are all slightly different, various differences in each one. So they have to be made to measure, they're bespoke. So you heard of the expression to measure twice and to cut once. They carefully measured the width of the lock and halved it, and that's the baseline for constructing lock gates. They were built, the old ones removed, the new ones taken up and dropped into place. Now I'm hoping you've all seen a spaghetti western.
Sure.
I'm hoping you've all remembered the moment when Clint Eastwood gets off his horse and walks into the bar. Everything stops, doesn't it? Who's the stranger in town? He walks into the bar. What's the only thing moving and possibly even squeaking behind him?
Swing it, the
doors.
The doors. The saloon doors.
The saloon doors. Guess what happened to the lock gates?
They did the same. Yeah.
Oh no.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Not an oh no, it's an oh yes. They didn't meet.
They didn't meet.
They'd forgotten to add the extra 4 inches onto each gate, the bevel, to allow them to shut at an angle. So they were promptly removed and left there. That was over 50 years ago. Built of English oak and a South American wood called greenheart, the second hardest wood in the world. They can't be rebuilt. They can't be adjusted. They're made to measure. Big problem. So they were abandoned there. And September last year, we had some of our joiners and carpenters from our 2 remaining lock gate making facilities. They were here on Anderton on a 2-day course. They came up the river and they looked at the lock gates. Now they look derelict, don't they? They look ancient. But they looked at them and said, what's the story behind those lock gates? They've never been installed. They recognised there was no wear and tear that you'd normally get on what could be 30, 40, 50-year-old lock gates. We told them the sorry tale. They were somewhat surprised. To build today, £250,000 per gate. So a huge amount of money wasted back in the day. Now on to something else that Northwich was famous for. Sadly, it was and not an is, but it's happened to many other places in the country. It had one of the biggest it was one of the biggest, busiest shipbuilding towns in the country, despite being 20 odd miles from the sea. And this is the largest vessel ever built here in Northwich. This was built by a company called Yarwoods, and they eventually closed in 1972. Sorry, 1968. Their competitors, Bimroth's, closed in 1972. This was built in 1956. A small seagoing ship, not very big. It's a very specialist tanker, 151 feet long, about 31 feet in beam, about 700 gross tons, built to carry a food product in liquid form that was not a fat or an oil, not a dairy product. Narrowing it down, molasses. Now you haven't cheated by having worked with the Athol company, have you? No. Right, okay. Built to carry molasses, yeah, which is partly refined cane sugar. Now, we don't have any sugar plantations here in the northwest of England. You do find her in the Caribbean and South America, and she was built for the United Molasses, who were sugar producers. And she sailed all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, 4,500 miles down to the southern islands in the Caribbean, a small size, had 3 sister ships as well of similar dimensions, made very, very suitable for going in and out of all the small docks, harbours and bays of the islands, and indeed those ports on Venezuela and South America, to pick up the refined, partly refined sugar in the form of molasses, transfer it to the bigger ocean-going, significantly bigger ocean-going tankers, to be brought back over here to be processed by the likes of Tate and Lyle. So Yarwoods, in their 90 years of significant vessel construction, produced 1,000 vessels in that time, from narrowboats right the way through to sea-going vessels like this one. The last vessel built was a tugboat, and built for service in, or purchased by them, built for the Maltese government, and 59 years on she's still in service in Valletta Harbour. We had that confirmed by a lady on the boat the other day who actually works for the harbour board, and she goes to work and still sees it, and she was quite pleased to see it, see where she didn't know basically it had come through all the way from Northwich here. Have a quick look as we go past here. Sunken barge. One of our former working boats, dumped there about 30-ish years ago. It's certainly been dumped there in the time that I've been living in the Northwich area. She was built in the early years of World War II, one of 296 built to the same design, the same construction methods, built to replace the lighters and barges lost as a result of the bombing during the Blitz of the early 1940s. Also used to supplement the convoy system. So when a convoy would arrive in Liverpool, the ships would go alongside, or the ships that couldn't go alongside would stay at anchor, and they'd tow out the barges and go alongside to discharge the cargoes into them, and then they could make use of whatever other wharf space or dock space was available in the docks at Liverpool. That was the principal purpose of them. But she was built by a company called Waitses in Barrow-in-Furness, and they were a construction company, one of many construction companies involved in the manufacture of barges like that. Shortage of iron and steel back in the early 1940s, built by a construction company. What was she made from? Concrete. Yeah, unusual, but not uncommon at that time. So yes, after World War II, went into, well, they came up for sale. Many were just abandoned, but they came up for sale from the Ministry of Supply, and the River Navigation purchased 2 of them for the princely sum of £50, so £25 each, which is pretty good value, even by the standards of the day. So, came into work for us. Now, they were never very popular. They didn't tow well, they didn't steer well, and they didn't even make very good hopper barges, which is what they were purchased for here on the river. So long since abandoned. However, the other half of the purchase, of the deal, is still afloat to sea in the National Waterways Museum at Ellesmere Port, our other sister attraction. We have the same management structure here. Okay. Any questions at all? Anything further on the river? Now, it's now time for me to do something we're uncomfortable doing, but you'll understand why in a moment, isn't it?
Fundraising.
Fundraising. The lift, it's been almost 25 years since the major work went on, and it needs a major service. Now, we have a good idea what's going on. However, you take your car in for a major service and leave it at the garage, yeah? Then you get home, and 25 minutes later there's a phone call, and you look, and it's oh, hello. That service, well, we found 1 or 2 other little problems. Now, hopefully there won't be any other little problems. However, we do need around about £11 million, which is principally going towards the mechanical and structural upkeep of the lift, a new control system, some new hydraulics, but more importantly, repainting. It was painted 20 odd years ago with a paint that was guaranteed for 20 years. It's done quite well. But the new paint is going to last 50 years. We're going to be spending £3.5 million or thereabouts on scaffolding alone to cover the structure. It's going to be grit blasted, repaired, painted. We need some money. Now here is a little connection here to the plastic that was invented alongside us here back in 1933, 91 years ago. Plastic technology has improved an awful lot in that time, and now you can remove that little bit of plastic that you keep in your wallet, tap it onto this machine, which we've nicknamed the Donatatron, because that's quite a wishy sort of modern name, and it magically removes £3 from your bank account. It also works in most other currencies as well, so don't try and say, I've got a dollar card. You say, no. So anybody wants to donate? Cash? You can put cash in the jar at the top. Yes. They do cash in the jar. If anyone wants to do cash in the jar, that's fine. Now, if you don't give us any money, we throw you overboard.
Oh, right.
We've got a few moments. I'll wander up down the boat before I've got to nip out and put the stern line on.
Hang on a minute.
In fact, I'll get ready to do that now. Yeah. I hope you've enjoyed it anyway. The weather is picking up. Probably by about when we finish at 4:30, it'll probably be the sun will be, say, cracking the flags by that time. There we go. Right, thanks very much. Now, it is a bit of a stubborn machine to try it. It may go beep. Ah, that's a good stuff. Thank you very much. It's £3, yeah. But if you're from Yorkshire, you get a discount. It's only £1.50. Right, okay.
I knew they were doing this because I saw the
Oh, right, okay.
passengers that came off doing
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
They are laughing.
Yeah, you're quite right. Sorry.
This is embarrassing.
I apologise.
I'm going to give up. If you want to give money, when you leave the building at the top, into the foyer, we've got the proper machine attached to the internet properly, and that
It's gone through.
it's gone through. It should work up there. Right, I can keep trying. It just occasionally beeps. Stuart, he's given up.
2 donations.
Temperamental.
2 donations.
Just taps. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed it.
Very good.
Yeah.